Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. I'm Carla Fredericks, as you can see on the screen there. I direct the program for immigrant and refugee child health at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital. I also have a clinical service at the Palm Center, where I take care of newly arrived children with special health care needs. I see a lot of familiar names popping up, and I'm sure that we have interacted also regarding the immigrant consult service that I do for medical questions for complex newly arrived children in the inpatient side. So I'm happy to be here, and I will pass it to my colleague, Dr. Michelli.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here as well. My name is Marina Michelli. I am a hospitalist doc at West Campus in PHM. I also intermittently float over to the Woodlands inpatient side and to main campus, but very rarely. Most of my time is at West Campus. I'm super excited to be here today. I'm a member of PERCH, the organization that Carla just mentioned, the Program for Immigrant and Refugee Child Health. And I am very passionate about caring for children in immigrant families.
Excellent. Well, I have the honor of kicking us off. So I'll do about the first half of the presentation, and then Dr. Michelli will do the second. Just so you all know, we are happy to take questions throughout, and Sujina has very kindly agreed to monitor the chat to see if there are any questions, and she'll interrupt us so that we can answer them in real time. All right, without any further ado, I will start sharing. Got to go back to slide 1. You're getting a sneak peek. All right, here we go. Okay. So we're excited to have a fair amount of time with you this afternoon to make sure that we get all of your questions answered. But we hope that by the end of the time together, we'll have met a few specific objectives. First of all, we hope that all of you will be able to describe the barriers that immigrant children face in accessing health services. And I'm certain that probably most of you could already do this, so it'll just be a little bit of a refresher. Next, we hope you'll be able to define different types of immigration status and discuss how each of these different statuses, as well as the current governmental policies, which do change rapidly, affect access to resources, including health services. Next, we hope you'll be able to describe the best practices for taking care of these children, as well as the resources available. Now, we specifically are focused on kids admitted to the hospital for the purpose of this talk, but the resources that are available are generally applicable to all different settings. So if you don't work on the inpatient side, never fear, this talk is also for you. Lastly, we'll be providing some avenues through which we can all advocate for immigrant children. Now, Ferris Bueller's Day Off was one of my favorite movies growing up, but I might be dating myself a little bit. But so when he asks a question, or asks for his attendance, they're just crickets because the kid's not there. So hopefully, if we were to ask this question to you, which we don't need to because I think you all know the answer, there wouldn't be crickets. You would all be jumping in to say an immigrant is somebody who moves from one place to another, crossing a border, an international border, for the purpose of permanent relocation. That is an immigrant. Okay, that is different from a migrant. A migrant is a broader category of people who are moving from one place to another, but that could be within the same country, could be to another country. And so today's talk is not focused on people who are only temporarily in the United States, but people who are hoping, planning to stay here permanently and have come from another country. The barriers to care for immigrants are vast, and what we see is often only the tip of the iceberg. So people certainly have problems with language barriers, communication, which affects everything from being able to make the appointment, to get the transportation to come to the appointment, to communicate while you're at the appointment, and complete the appropriate follow-up and get medications. Cultural differences. The United States health system is very different than that of most countries around the world. So understanding that, as well as other social customs. Logistics can be a huge problem. Insurance. This probably falls into your lap a lot because Harris County has the largest number of uninsured children of any county across the United States. So I am sure that this comes up in your line of work all the time. And as you know, it can be a huge obstacle. Cost, especially if you don't have insurance. Discrimination, that certainly happens, unfortunately. And also the fear of discrimination, the fear of deportation, the fear of some type of negative consequence for seeking care. All right. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on the different types of immigration status. And part of that is because it falls into your lap a lot. So I give a fair number of talks to clinicians, as does Dr. Michele. And we teach them not to put immigration status in the record. Now, that is because these records can be subpoenaed, and that could have detrimental effects on this person, especially if you were to write something that shows that this person does not have documentation to be in the United States permanently. However, I recognize that social workers have a slightly different role than clinicians who are focused on taking care of the child medically, because you do need to determine their immigration status in order to know for which benefits they are eligible. So let's go ahead and go through them. Naturalized citizen. So someone who's born outside of the United States, but then becomes a United States citizen. Of course, if you're born outside the United States to US citizen parents, that is different. You would already be a US citizen. But if your parents are not US citizens and you were born outside of the United States, there are pathways to citizenship, as you know, for immigrants. So someone could be a naturalized US citizen. A lawful permanent resident is someone who has a green card, sometimes called LPRs, or green card holders. So naturalized citizens have the same rights and access to benefits, as you well know, as US born citizens. LPRs have access to a lot of the same benefits. One thing to note is that Medicaid at the federal level was determined to require a waiting period for green card holders, where people who got a green card were supposed to wait 5 years in order to use Medicaid benefits. However, the federal government gave the states the ability to waive that requirement, okay, to get rid of that requirement. And most states have done that, including Texas. So in Texas and in many other states, you do not need to wait for 5 years if you are a child to get your Medicaid. Okay, you can get it right away once you have your green card. There are a lot of different statuses, and just in the past year or two, more have been added, making things a lot more complicated. So we won't go into excruciating detail about these, but it would be important for you to be aware of them. The first one that I will discuss is Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, or SIJS. This status is something that a child, so someone less than 18, can apply for, and it's for people who have been abused, neglected, or abandoned by one or both parents. It takes a long time to process these applications, so a lot of times someone might be over 18 and this is still pending, but you have to apply before you turn 18, okay? The great thing about Special Immigrant Juvenile Status is that there's a path to citizenship. Another nice benefit is that if you have applied for this, even if you haven't been approved for it, if you've just applied for it, you are eligible in Texas for CHIP, Children's Health Insurance Program. Okay, I'm going to repeat that again. If you have applied, even if you turned in your application 2 weeks ago, you are eligible for CHIP. Now, you're going to have a fight. You're going to have a fight at the Medicaid office, but they are eligible. That is the law. And so please do try to get CHIP for these kids if you find out that they've applied for special immigrant juvenile status. And honestly, please let me know what barriers you encounter, because I know that it's not easy, but that's a benefit that is legally available for these children, and they should be getting it. Okay, I will step off my soapbox about that. T visas, that's for victims of trafficking. Okay, so if somebody has already obtained a T visa, then they have the permanent ability to remain in the United States. There are no benefits to having just applied for one, besides the fact that you can remain here until your application is decided, but you don't have access to Medicaid, which you would after it's been approved. U visas, those are for people, not just kids, but anybody who has been a victim of crime in the United States. The crime has to have occurred in the United States, and you are cooperating with law enforcement to help solve the crime. U visas also have a path to citizenship. TPS stands for temporary protected status. TPS is available to people who are from certain countries and were here in the United States at the time that an event occurred in your home country, and it was determined that would not be safe for you to go back. So TPS is available to certain people from many different countries, depending on if they were here at the time that the US government decided to grant TPS to that country. So I'll give you an example, a recent example. So when the war broke out in Ukraine, Ukrainians who were already in the US could get temporary protected status so that they would not have to return to Ukraine. Let's say they were here on a work visa and they lost their job, right? They would have to leave the country, but they could get TPS after the war broke out in Ukraine so that they could remain in the US temporarily. Now, this needs to be renewed, TPS needs to be renewed by the government regularly. It doesn't continue indefinitely, and it does not give you a path to citizenship at this time, TPS. Okay, humanitarian parole. This was not on the slide when we gave this presentation in the past because it really didn't exist until about 2 years ago. It existed, but there were very few people who had something called humanitarian parole. Now it's being used by the government for a lot of different groups. And so you're going to see this if you haven't already. So the biggest group that first got this humanitarian parole were Afghans who were evacuated by the United States in August of 2021. Okay, so about 2 years ago. If you recall, if you saw the news reports at that time, the US evacuated around 100,000 people in a matter of weeks, and it was very chaotic. They evacuated people to military bases abroad, and then they brought most of them, about 80,000 of them, to the United States. Most people were on military bases in the US for a set amount of time, and then they were resettled to communities across the country. Estimates are that the Houston area has about 6,000 Afghans from this resettlement. We have other Afghans who've come to Houston in different ways, but this particular resettlement, we got a large chunk of them. So out of the 80,000, that's a lot for one city. Humanitarian parole for Afghans does come with Medicaid for the children, okay? But humanitarian parole is only good for 2 years. It gives you access to benefits, it gives the parents the ability to work, etc., but it is not permanent. Congress recently passed something that says you can renew your humanitarian parole from Afghanistan for another 2 years, okay? Because we're coming up right on the 2-year mark. That's not a permanent solution. So there's an Afghan Adjustment Act that's recently been introduced into the House and the Senate that would give humanitarian parolees from Afghanistan the opportunity to get green cards. That has not been passed yet, but it is in Congress right now. Okay, so hopefully it will be passed. If you have humanitarian parole from Ukraine, you also have access to Medicaid as a child. Okay, it's only good for, the parole is again only good for 2 years. Okay. There are other countries that have recently been given humanitarian parole. Not everybody from that country has humanitarian parole. I just want to keep emphasizing this. So you have to kind of ask. But humanitarian parole from Venezuela, Haiti, Cuba, and Nicaragua does not come with Medicaid for the children. So it's very, very complicated. So it helps to try to just read up as much as you can. But I understand that it's hard to stay up to date because those last 4 countries that I just mentioned, that just came about within the last year, calendar year. All right, let's keep going, but you could always ask questions later. These are in red because they're highlighted throughout this talk, okay? Refugees and asylum seekers, all right? They're not the same thing. A lot of times people say refugee and they're not actually meaning formal refugees, okay? So refugee is a designation that has to be given to you before you enter the United States. Okay, so if you came to the United States through Mexico and showed up at the southern border and said, I need safety, that is not a refugee, okay? Because you were not determined to have that status by the United States before you arrived, okay? And it's not something you can apply for once you get here. So everybody who is a formal refugee was determined to have that status prior to arrival in the United States. And they're given that based on what is called a well-founded, so already deemed legitimate fear of persecution or harm if they were to return to their home country. And it has to be for one of 5 reasons: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Has to be for one of those 5 reasons, okay? If you are a refugee in the United States, you flew here, okay? 100% of refugees in the United States were flown here, okay? So that will give you a clue. Obviously, not everybody who flew to the US as an immigrant is a refugee, so it doesn't work the opposite way, but all refugees flew here, okay? So that could help you if you're trying to determine their status. They have case managers if they're within the first 5 years of resettlement at one of the resettlement agencies. In Houston, there are 4. There used to be 5, but now there are 4. YMCA, the Alliance, Interfaith, and Catholic Charities. Okay, so you can ask them who their agency is, who their case manager is, and you can potentially coordinate with them to get them the services that they need. The case manager is supposed to be helping with everything, right? They're supposed to be helping them maintain their housing, have the kids in school, get jobs, learn English if they don't already speak it, etc. But a lot of these case managers are overworked. They don't have time to help every individual family on their caseload. So you can actually play a role, and you can certainly play a role as the case manager from the resettlement agency is transitioning out. So let's say the child has a chronic condition. They're going to be followed by Texas Children's for a long time. The case manager is going to have to devote their time to newly arrived families. So after a year or 2, they'd be happy for you to take over the social work role. So you are needed for these kids, even if they do have a case manager already. Refugees' kids are eligible for Medicaid from the second they step foot in the United States. The case manager cannot apply for it before they are physically in the US, but they are supposed to apply for it right away. So if they don't have it, it's probably pending, but check and make sure they already applied, or something has happened, like a piece of paper was missing, or they had it and then now they need to renew or something, but they are eligible. Just like any other kid in the US, if the parent ends up making too much money, they might not be eligible anymore, but otherwise they're eligible for Medicaid and CHIP. Okay, asylum seekers. Asylum seekers may have come to the United States fleeing the same types of things that refugees are fleeing, but nobody has determined that their fear is well-founded yet, okay? Refugees, they don't need to go to court and prove anything. They already have a path to citizenship. Green card in a year, 4 years after that, they can naturalize. Asylum seekers have to prove it. They have to go to court and prove why they would be at risk if they were to return to their home country, okay? While they are waiting for their case to be decided, they do not have access to a lot of benefits, Okay. And that's the bulk of who we see newly arrived families that have come across our southern border. They're seeking safety in the US. They don't already have legal status here. They may be applying for something, but it's not been granted yet. Okay. So they don't have access to a lot of benefits. If they are granted asylum, they become an asylee. Please don't confuse those words because a lot of people do. Okay. They use the same, they say asylum seeker and asylee. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as refugee. Okay. Asylees have been granted asylum. They are no longer seeking it. They got it. If you are one of the lucky ones to get asylum and be an asylee, you have all the benefits of a refugee. Okay.
Dr. Fredericks,
Yes,
there's
ma'am.
a question in the chat. If a family with green cards have too much money for Medicaid, can they still apply for Medicaid waivers and qualify?
I'm not sure I understand the part about the Medicaid waiver.
Want me to repeat it again?
No, maybe Diane, can you clarify that maybe?
Medicaid waiver waives the family income.
Okay, I don't know about that. That's a great question, but they should be like a US citizen in that. So however Medicaid waivers work, which I don't know, for US citizens, I would think, but I don't know for sure, but I would think it would be like a US citizen. Okay, yes. So thank you for the question, and others feel free to keep dropping those in. All right. So asylum seekers, what kinds of things can you get for them? Well, we'll get into that later. That's going to be in Dr. Michelle's part, but there are some resources available, but not many. All right. Unaccompanied immigrant children. We see a lot of these. Okay. We have 10 programs in the Houston area, 6 of them, which are fairly big, 4, which are relatively new to the scene, that house children who came to the United States and presented at the US border without a parent or legal guardian. Okay. So these kids, when they're apprehended by Border Patrol, we're going to get into the details later, but just so you know, they go to stay in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and the ORR grants, they provide grants to certain organizations across the country to care for these kids until they can be placed with sponsors in the United States, who are typically family members. Okay, undocumented. This also, like some people who are asylum seekers, get lumped into the undocumented category. All right. Technically, they're not undocumented if they presented at the border and were processed by Customs and Border Protection. They have a document. They have a piece of paper that says they have temporary permission to be in the United States until their case is processed. So sometimes we call them undocumented, but really they do have temporary permission to be here, which allows them to travel across the United States. Someone who's truly undocumented, for instance, they crossed the border, they were never apprehended by Border Patrol. They don't have that. They can't pass a checkpoint in the United States, etc. But sometimes we also lump people who've overstayed their visa into the undocumented category. So let's say you came on a tourist visa and then you were supposed to go back to your home country when your tourist visa expired, but you didn't. So then you might be in this category as well. Access to very little benefits, just like people seeking asylum. All right, we have finally moved on past the definitions, but I think setting that stage is super important for the rest of the talk. Oh, is there another question?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's
Yes.
a question.
I see it. Thank you. Okay. So that's a great question. How difficult is it to get special immigrant juvenile status? So I cannot tell you exactly how difficult it is, but I can tell you that it is not as hard to get as asylum. So a lot of times there is a child, they have a parent that is, very involved, very loving. But even if the other parent, let's say you talk to a family And you see mom and the child, they're new immigrants here. And you say, oh, is dad in the US as well? No. We don't know. Oh, is he involved in her life? No, he abandoned me when I was pregnant with her. Boom. That child is eligible to apply. Okay. So I don't know how hard it is to prove because I'm not an attorney, but I can tell you that the rates of approval for special immigrant juvenile status are much better than asylum. So if a lawyer is trying to decide between the two and the child is potentially eligible for both, they would go with special immigrant juvenile status. Okay, great question. All right, refugees. I put all these different pictures up because refugees can look like anything and they can be anywhere. Okay, so you might think of a refugee camp. You might think of urban refugees in a city abroad. You might think of the people at the moment that they're fleeing and they're just grabbing whatever they can carry on their head or in their arms. But they're also our neighbors. They're also going to school with our children. They're integrated into society. They're on your kid's sports team. Okay. And you might not know that they came as a refugee. Now they're potentially US citizens already. So, and every single one has a different story, even if they all came from the same country. They have a different experience, a different story. All right. As non-clinicians, and I know clinicians also sometimes, well, often refers to mental health clinicians, and many of you are that. And so what I mean is physical health. You don't have to worry about testing for TB and things like that. But just so you know, they do have access to the Harris County Refugee Health Screening Program, which used to screen these kids and families within 90 days of arrival, most often within 30 days. They have such a backlog that I recently saw a family who got an appointment 11 months after arrival. So it's going to be, middle of next year. So this is something that we need to be taking on if we see these kids before they're screened. And also keep in mind, they don't do mental health screening. It's not a full well child checkup. Okay. And so, which as you can imagine is a big concern. They have case manager, as I mentioned, and they're immediately eligible for benefits. All right. Asylum seekers. We used to think of all asylum seekers, almost all asylum seekers, as coming from Central America and making this journey that was like on average 53 marathons, coming from most often the Northern Triangle of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. You guys, if you were here, even just working in Houston just a few years ago, that was a bread and butter. If you happen to be at the border, that's what you would see. Everybody spoke Spanish. Things are vastly different now. Okay. But before I get into that, I'll tell you, it's not because the problems in the Northern Triangle have gotten any better. Okay. It's just that there have been some policies restricting their entry to the United States. And there are also a lot more problems in other countries around the world that are leading people to be forcibly displaced. Okay. But a lot of the kids coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, that's still the majority of unaccompanied children that we see. Okay. And they're fleeing these things, gang violence, abuse, trafficking, and the journey itself is fraught with kidnapping, assault, etc. It's not easy. A lot of times people tell you, ask a child, sometimes they say, I came caminando, walking. And so people write in the chart, like child walked from Guatemala. So I just want to clarify that sometimes you see on the news, these big caravans of people walking. That's not how most people come. Usually they take buses. They might be in the back of a truck. They might have ridden in between or on top of a train, very dangerous, obviously, lots of people injured and killed doing that through Mexico. But it's not usually walking 53 marathons by foot. Some of it may have been by foot, but not the whole thing usually. All right. Now, I mentioned that demographics are changing. So let's look at the right, for instance. And I want you to focus on the light blue. Okay. Look at the light blue. So in 2008, that light blue was like, you can't even see it. That's other countries besides Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Okay. So the immigrants that were coming to our southern border, and it says between ports of entry. So that means people who were not crossing a bridge in an official port of entry, having paperwork saying they can come to the US. So those who kind of knew, like, I can't go across a bridge because I don't have paperwork, so I'm going to just try to get there by crossing the Rio Grande, etc. Almost everybody was from Mexico or those 3 Northern Triangle countries. Okay. Look at 2022. Almost half of the people are now from other countries outside of that region. Okay. Things have drastically changed in 14, 15 years. And the change really didn't happen that gradually. Even in like 2019, it's only like 10% of the encounters were from people outside that region. Okay. Now it's almost half. All right. You're seeing people from all around the world, and they're making this journey, and it's even more treacherous because oftentimes they're either from South America or they're flying into South America because they could get a visa to one of those countries. They want to come to the US, but they couldn't get a visa to any country closer. So they're flying into a South American country and they're making the journey by land all the way up. And there's an infamous part of that journey called the Darien Gap, which is between Panama and Colombia. There used to be very few people that would attempt to cross that. Now there are tens of thousands, if not more, people trying to get through that. Okay. People are being injured. They're being attacked. They're getting sick and dying. It's incredibly, incredibly difficult, this journey. And then they still have all of Central America, Mexico to go, and then difficulties, let's be transparent, when they come to our border as well. Okay. What people have been through is unfathomable.
Dr. Fredericks, there's another
Yes,
question.
ma'am. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm in the chat. So I am going to.
It's from Clarissa.
Clarissa?
Mhm.
Okay. So a family from Honduras, they have a permit to work in the US. Okay, they have TPS, right? So TPS comes with work authorization. Great. Parent has a social security number and they have insurance. Okay, interesting. The insurance.
Do you know what type of insurance they have? Like,
Yeah.
because to my knowledge, TPS.
They have United.
Oh, United Healthcare.
Okay. So maybe they get that through their job.
Yeah.
All right. So the child has children with special health care needs. Okay. It expires when they turn 21. Okay. Right. They're waiting for approval for asylum, which can take years. She needs to get a pump. All right. Since patient continues to renew her work permit while waiting this, is it safe to say this family will get insurance? Okay. Well, if it's through the job and the job is providing the insurance, then that is safe. Okay. But if it's not through the job, it's got to be through the job because as of now, they're trying to change it.
But that's unlikely.
What'd you say?
Unless they're like paying for it out of pocket, like if they
Oh,
went.
out of pocket. Yes, you could also do that, but it seems unlikely. You're right. Yes. So since you're waiting on the asylum, right? So it would have to be through your job. It would have to be private insurance if it's not children with special health care needs. And then you'd have to think about, so yeah, Veronica, great question, the Affordable Care Act. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly certain that people with TPS cannot buy insurance through the exchanges, much like DACA recipients. And that is something that the Biden administration is trying to change. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so they're trying to change it. I mean, it's a priority, supposedly. So maybe that will happen even in this calendar year, that will be different. But as of now, no, they can't buy insurance through the exchanges. So the other thing I was going to say is that, let's say they lost their insurance, they lost their job, if it's job sponsored insurance, remember the gold card. We're at Texas Children's, so we're not part of the Harris Health system. But the gold card can be fantastic for people. Yes, it's best for people, like it has the most benefit for financially for people who are below 150% of the federal poverty level. but it can still protect against catastrophic costs like inpatient stays, et cetera. So don't forget about that. I'm not sure, but Harris Health Financial Assistance Program does include durable medical equipment and prescriptions. Yeah, so some people can get insurance through the exchanges. It just depends on their status. Yeah, it might not, if they don't have TPS or if they're not DACA, because those ones they can't. Okay, great. So all good things. And like, I mean, honestly, there's no harm in trying. What's the worst that can happen? You don't get the insurance, right? Okay, thank you for that question. Let's keep going. All right, oops. All right, so let's talk about asylum seekers. All right, so we talked about people coming, what happens on this journey, and now you get to the border. Okay, so you all may have seen the very recent news reports about tactics that Texas state is using to try to keep people from entering the US at the Texas-Mexico border. Okay, so people who know that they can't cross a bridge, as I mentioned, because they don't have permission to do so, they may be trying to cross the river, and there is now a floating barrier with razor wire in parts of the river, also along the banks. But people are still coming. So the reason that people come is often because they have no other option. They have no other option. They do not see a way for them to live anywhere else. And so people are going to still keep coming. They're just going to have more injuries. But so a lot of people, especially families traveling with children, okay, they are not trying to evade Border Patrol. Okay, they're coming to the United States. I'm not talking about single adults. That's a different story. Okay. But especially if they have small children, they're coming to the US, they're seeking safe haven. Okay. They are looking for help when they get across the border. Okay. So a lot of families with small children, they are apprehended by Border Patrol, like you might see in this photo, and then taken for processing at a Customs and Border Protection facility. All right. So there is something new that we wanted to talk to you about as well. So it is called the CBP One app. Okay, so a lot of you might have heard about something called Title 42. Title 42 went into place on March 20th, 2020 at the start of the pandemic, okay? It was a CDC policy that was invoked for the first time to, under the purpose, it was purported to be protecting the public health of Americans. But in reality, how it was used was to deter immigrants who are coming across our southern border, okay? Because what it said was, if you are from a country that has COVID, you can't enter, okay? But of course, we know that COVID was in all countries, and they were only selectively applying this rule to people from certain countries, okay? And what they would do is they would just push you back into Mexico and say, like, we can't let you in. Even if you were like, I will be killed if I return to my home country, they were like, you need to go back to Mexico. We have a public health emergency. Or they would put you on a plane and deport you back to your home country, okay? So hundreds of thousands of people were subject to Title 42 removals. However, there was no penalty for coming without paperwork under Title 42. So if you got pushed back to Mexico, chances are you're just going to keep trying until you get across the border without getting caught. Okay. So there were a lot of encounters during that time, and we never registered who it was, right? We would just, and I say we, I mean the US government, we would just push people back to Mexico. And so we didn't know who was crossing twice, 3 times, 4 times and getting caught because there was no penalty. So we didn't even write down who you were. Okay. Title 42 ended on May 11th of this year. Okay. And everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people thought that would mean a surge in immigration because there were all these people that were trying to get across beforehand and they couldn't. However, we reverted back to a policy that says, there are two things we did. We reverted back to a policy that says if you cross without paperwork and you're determined to not be able to stay in the US and apply for asylum or another type of humanitarian relief, we will bar you from entering the country for 5 years. Okay, so people are a little bit afraid of that. And then what is also a huge issue is a new Biden era policy that is currently being fought in the courts, but is in place right now. That says you have to apply for asylum and be denied asylum in at least one country that you've passed through on the way to the United States, or we won't let you in. Okay, so if you're getting processed at a Customs and Border Protection facility and you have an interview with an asylum officer, you have to prove that there's at least a 10% chance that you could get asylum by telling your story. Okay, but if in your story, you don't say that you applied for asylum and were denied it in one of the countries that you passed through, then they can apply this new policy to you and say, you're not eligible. You got to go back to your home country. And if any of you heard about the 8-year-old who died in Harlingen in CBP custody, she had sickle cell anemia and the flu, and she died, and her family was subject to this policy. They were awaiting deportation back to their home country when she got sick. Without that policy, they probably would have been released into the United States to pursue asylum. So on that negative note, CBP One app gets around that. Okay, so you don't have to have applied for asylum and been denied it in a country. If you got an appointment to enter the United States and get an interview through this app. All right. So one of the reasons, according to experts, that there aren't as many people crossing right now is because they're trying to get appointments through the app because they know they'll be better off. Okay. So they're waiting, they're applying every day. They're trying to get an appointment on the app every day. They're trying. Some people are getting them. And some people that are like staying in the shelter near them are getting them. So they're being encouraged. Okay, they got one. I got to wait. And it's been a couple of months. There are a lot of problems with the app. It crashes. It's not in your language of preference. You're having trouble getting an appointment for your whole family at the same time, etc. But the people who get these appointments don't have to, like I said, show that they applied for asylum in another country and were denied it. Okay, so they have a better chance of being allowed to stay in the US and pursue a case. And you also, don't have to try to cross the Rio Grande and avoid this floating barrier and razor wire. You just cross the bridge because you show them, I have an appointment. You show the Border Patrol. All right. So I got into some dramatics there, but that's just the reality of the life on the border. Are there any questions that I should address before I?
Yeah, we have some questions.
Okay.
Can we access to this presentation? Yes, we will be sharing the presentation after this session is over. There's a question from Marina. Oh, sorry.
Oh, from Marina.
Sorry, I was just answering the question about the presentation. I was just saying, keep in mind that these policies that we're talking about change so frequently. Carla and I have been giving this presentation for the past couple of years.
Yeah.
And we're always having to change stuff. So if we send you guys the slides, just keep in mind that some of this stuff may even be outdated, like in a few months.
Yeah, right. Like, as I mentioned, there's a lawsuit about this new policy that you have to have applied for asylum in another country. So that could be, nullified tomorrow by the time we send you the slides. Okay. So Hania, that is correct. That is correct. So, it is not illegal to seek asylum. It is not illegal to show up in between ports of entry in the United States and ask for asylum. Okay, that's not illegal. The government, the past administration tried to make that everybody think that that's illegal, but it's not. Okay, so international law and things, yes, that the US has agreed to say that it is not. What the Texas government is doing, and I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but part of what they're doing besides putting up barriers, is they've deployed non-border patrol people to the border, right? Law enforcement. And then they are arresting people for trespassing. So they're saying like they're on someone else's property when they cross the border. So now they're prosecuted as a criminal instead of someone who's seeking asylum, which is not a crime. Okay. How long is the average wait time for an appointment? I don't know. I don't think we have good data on that. The app just rolled out over the last few months. So people are definitely getting appointments. There are people who've been waiting months. So my understanding is there's a certain number of appointments per day, and they give them to people that day. And then they go back and see how many people have been waiting, and the people who've been waiting the longest will get the remaining appointments. So I don't know what the average wait time is. We don't know. I mean, the government just started using the app for this purpose a few months ago. Okay. All right. And so I'm going to leave that next question to Dr. Michelli. Yes? Okay. All right. Let me wrap up. So we've gone through this a little bit. Okay. So let's say you're taken to a Customs and Border Protection facility. It might look like this. Okay. They tried to make it look less like a jail by getting rid of the chain link fences and putting plexiglass up instead. So it's not really much better. Okay. So they can be very crowded. They're very cold. They insist that they have to keep the temperature low. And there is a range, like there's written policy for what range of temperature it has to be in, but it can be as low as in the 60s. And, like in the summer, that nobody came with clothes prepared for that. So these people are actually under like the blankets you use for hypothermia, like these Mylar blankets, just trying to stay warm. The lights are on 24/7. They claim that's for security purposes. You can see that there are porta potties. So, I mean, yes, you have access to bathrooms, but sometimes people don't want to go and they're holding it for too long. They're getting urinary tract infections, other problems, etc. You are fed 3 meals a day, not to say that those are good meals. It might be a half frozen burrito, but you're fed 3 meals a day, and you have water to drink. No human should be held in these for more than a couple of days. I mean, really, we could do better for even during those times. But because of a couple policy changes, like deporting more people are waiting longer for their deportation flights. And then also trying to complete these interviews at the processing facility. And there's just not enough asylum officers to do all the interviews. People are staying longer in these terrible conditions. But most families who they pass the interview, then they're released into the United States. Okay. And most people have a friend or family member with whom they're planning to stay, and they travel on from there to pursue their asylum case. Okay. And they have to go to court in wherever that address is. Okay. So if they have an aunt in Houston and they're coming to Houston to stay with her, then the government is writing all of that down, and they're like, okay, this is your notice to appear in court, NTA, notice to appear. Some people are released with that one, which is a disaster, but you're supposed to have one. Okay. So you don't get to choose, like, I want to go to New York. I want my court case in New York because I heard it's easier to get asylum in New York, which is true. It's different by judge. And this is all publicly available information. You can see each judge's approval rate of asylum. In Houston, the approval rate is like 15%. It's very low. It's very low. And a few years ago, it was less than 10%. Okay. It's improved slightly. Right. So a lot of these families that you're seeing, they're applying for asylum. They should still apply for asylum. I'm not deterring people from applying for asylum. It's going to take years to process their case in most instances. And most of them are not going to get it unless something drastically changes in the next couple of years in the Houston area. Okay. So we can't hang our hats on, all right, well, but when they get asylum, then we'll be able to get this kid Medicaid. Okay. You don't count on that. I'm such a Debbie Downer. So Marina is going to give you some things that you can do instead of me just telling you what you can't do for these families. But thank you.
Other states are a little more generous with who they grant the asylum case to, but Texas is definitely not one of them.
Yeah. And nationwide, sorry, Marina, nationwide, about half of people who apply for asylum, like 45%, Do you get it?
All right. Can everyone see the slide? I just took over control of the presentation. Okay, awesome. And let me know if anything's unclear. If you guys can monitor the chat, that'd be awesome. Okay, so as Carla mentioned, while waiting their hearing, asylum seekers qualify for very little resources. Of course, once they get granted the asylee status, they qualify for a lot more. But while they're waiting, asylum seekers and undocumented patients don't qualify for much. So as you guys might already know, a patient that is undocumented or asylum seeking can qualify for emergency Medicaid. Some states allow asylum seekers and undocumented children to qualify for their state Medicaid, but unfortunately, Texas is not one of those states. So like California, for example, if you live like in DC, I think Connecticut, I forget some of the other states, but there are a few states in the US that do allow undocumented people to have Medicaid. Remember under the EMTALA Act, or the Emergency Medical Treatment Labor Act, I forget what it stands for, but anyone can present and be seen by an ER regardless of immigration status. And so for patients, basically what happens in our hospital is for patients who don't qualify for Medicaid based on immigration status, they're offered an emergency Medicaid form by TCH Financial Services. And so if you meet the income requirement, you can get emergency Medicaid, which retroactively pays for the ER visit. If it's for an actual emergency, that's the key. So you can't go to the ER for like an ear infection. The ER doc has to sign off that it was an emergency. So it pays for the ER visit and the hospitalization, but it does not cover follow-up visits or prescription medications, unfortunately. Another insurance listed here is children with special healthcare needs, which you guys have already kind of chatted about in the chat a little bit. But for those of you who don't know, it's a state-funded insurance in Texas that children can apply to regardless of immigration status, which is awesome. You have to live in Texas, you have to be under 21, and you have to have a qualifying chronic medical problem that limits major life activities. Mental and behavioral health problems do not count toward that, unfortunately. So it has to be a physical condition, and the doctor has to sign off that they have that condition, and they have to put like the little ICD-9 or 10 code. There's a very long waiting list for children with special healthcare needs, sometimes like over a year. But once kids do have this insurance, it's super awesome and covers a ton of stuff. I've come across a few complex care patients on the inpatient side that I think that I thought at the time could have qualified for the insurance. And I had to like ask financial services and or social work to provide the application. But I feel like a lot of PHM docs might not know about children with special healthcare needs. So if you encounter a patient with a chronic medical condition that you think might qualify for this, who doesn't qualify for Medicaid, talk to the PHM attending on and ask if you think that they have a long-term chronic condition that they could qualify for, and if they could sign off on the form. And then for financial assistance to cover healthcare and medication costs, we kind of briefly mentioned earlier the Harris Health Financial Assistance Program, or the Gold Card. You have to live in Harris County to qualify and meet the income requirement, which is like less than 150% of the federal poverty level. So you can't live in Fort Bend County, for example. You have to live in Harris County. It's technically not insurance, but it can cover a ton of stuff like clinic visits and prescription medications for people presenting at Harris Health clinics or Harris Health hospitals. It's an excellent long-term option for patients to only have charity care for like a limited period of time. And then there's also GoodRx, as you guys probably already know. This website has a ton of great like low-cost coupon options for patients. Sometimes the physicians have to like play around with it a little bit. So for example, if you put in like a liquid medication, it's gonna like have like a super high cost, but if you put it in the tablet, it can be much lower. So you can always like instruct the family to like, or ask the physician if it's okay to like crush a tab and mix it with water, for example. That would be a huge savings for the family. And then finally, there's TCH Charity Care, as you guys know, and funding is done on a case-by-case basis, and it can cover discharge medications and some follow-up visits for a limited period of time, but it typically doesn't cover DME or equipment. So that's kind of a bummer. So there's always issues with that that we encounter on the inpatient setting. And then at West Campus, we have like these HEB vouchers that we can give out to patients as well without having to do a charity care application. So those for prescriptions under $300, we can talk to our social workers at West Campus, and then they can send families this coupon to help pay for medications that are sent to the HEB near West Campus. But for prescriptions over $300, we have to send the prescriptions to main campus's pharmacy, unfortunately, and then our patients have to go to main campus to pick it up if they're covered under charity care. And so next is PCPs. So many asylum-seeking children are not connected to medical homes on the inpatient setting. There are a couple different options for these families. Federally qualified health centers are obligated to see everyone regardless of immigration status or insurance status. They have a sliding scale program for uninsured kiddos. Examples of FQHCs in Houston include like Legacy Clinic, Hope Clinic, Pasadena Health Center. And then TCH also has 7 community cares practices that are also low-cost sliding scale for families without insurance. On the Perch website, which we will give to you guys, we have a list of low-cost clinics in Houston. Many of you might already have access to this list, but it's amazing. There's like FQHCs and TCH community cares practices and a bunch of other low-cost clinic options for families in Houston. It has a giant map of Houston and all of these little clinics, and then what services they offer. And some of them also offer adult services as well, like family medicine clinics that even the parent can go to. And then, as you guys know, many families are food insecure. So if you have a family who struggles with food insecurity, the Houston Food Bank is an excellent resource. I recommend Googling the patient's address and then helping them find the location closest to their home rather than just giving them the link, because it's really hard sometimes for these families, especially newly arrived families. They're so overwhelmed and to like navigate like how to find the closest one to their house. And then remember that undocumented and asylum seeking families don't qualify for food stamps or SNAP, but if they have a child under the age of 5, they can qualify for WIC regardless of immigration status. So that is a really great resource for families. And then, okay, this slide, I honestly, I don't have a ton of information about housing. There are very limited housing resources that I know of in the Houston area for asylum seeking or undocumented patients. Carla put together this slide, but for housing, there's Casa Juan Diego, which to my understanding is usually quite full. I don't know if you have anything else to say about housing, Carla.
I was going to put something in the chat quickly that don't forget about Ronald McDonald House as a possible option, right? I mean, not long term, obviously, but especially if you're interacting people on the inpatient side.
And we will send you guys these slides too. So here's a couple of like clothing resources for families as well. And then here's another resource for baby formula. It provides emergency formula assistance for families. And then finally, many asylum seekers may benefit from legal assistance, as you guys saw from Carla's slide on immigration status. There is no constitutional right to counsel in the immigration court system. So many asylum seekers do not have legal representation, and having legal representation dramatically improves their chances of winning their immigration case. So the Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative, or HILSC, is an excellent resource for immigrants in our community who need legal representation or who just have questions about their like rights in general. They have like a free hotline that you can call. But it's an organization that connects people with volunteer immigration lawyers who offer low cost or free immigration advice to families. And then additionally, the TCH Medical Legal Partnership does not do any paperwork regarding change of immigration status, but they can review applications that have already been made, and they can connect families with an immigration lawyer to review those applications through the Houston Volunteer Lawyers Network. And then briefly, there's another resource called the Kids in Need of Defense Program, or KIND. They have a Central American Minors Application Program, just FYI, that provides free assistance to parents and legal guardians in the US who are wanting to bring their children into the US legally. So it's super awesome. Parents can fill out the application online, and we'll give you guys a link to the website. And they also have a screening clinic at Baker Ripley coming up in mid-August, just FYI. And then we kind of touched on this in the chat, but an immigrant family may ask someone from the medical team to write a letter stating why the caregiver should not be deported, or why it's very important for them to stay here because their child is medically complex and their child needs them to be here. So I've written a couple of these for patient families before. They're pretty easy to write. You can just talk about the child's condition and how the parent has been instrumental in their child's care here in the US. Oops. And we also have a fairly new Baylor Asylum Clinic. This is a student-run clinic, and it's through an organization called Physicians for Human Rights, or PHR. And so basically students and physicians that are trained through Physician for Human Rights assist with conducting physical and psychological forensic examinations on asylum-seeking patients. So basically a lawyer can ask this Baylor Asylum Clinic to do a write-up, and then they can use the document in court to support the asylum seeker's case. But the family must already have a lawyer, and the lawyer is the one that requests the evaluation through the Physician for Human Rights. All right. Did I miss any questions in the chat so far?
There was a question from Carissa. Does it depend on the patient's condition to determine when CSHCN is approved, but some patient I have follow receives CSHCN within the same year?
I do think that they have a priority list when they're determining who gets it and who doesn't. I think if it's a more severe condition, they can prioritize them a little bit, but I still think that the waiting list is it tends to be quite long.
Another question from Aisha. She says, are those community resources for food, clothing current? I've noticed recently that a lot of programs that we used to count on does not have as much funding and resources available anymore, sadly.
Carla, do you have a comment on that? I mean, I agree that the funding of a lot of these community programs tends to be transient for many of them.
Yes, that's unfortunately, that's absolutely the case. Someone will have a rent and utility assistance program that, lasts for a couple of weeks, and then the funding dries up, and then you have to figure out where else you can refer people. So this does happen, but those were all resources that the HILSC, as Marina mentioned, the Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative, they have an access to services committee. So all of those were suggested by members of that committee within the last couple of months. So they're recent, but it's not to say things couldn't have changed.
Awesome. Okay, so let's move on to asylum seeking unaccompanied immigrant children. So reminder, these are children under the age of 18 without a legal guardian who are seeking safe haven here in the US, either by applying for asylum or one of those other special statuses that we mentioned earlier, like the special immigrant juvenile status. About 2/3 of these kiddos are male and about 1/3 are female. They're usually between 12 and 17 years old. And the majority of them come from Central America, and with about 3% of them coming from Mexico. The reason why we're separating out this group is that they go through a different process, and they actually do qualify for certain resources when they initially arrive to the US. So when these kiddos come to the US, they are processed in that same kind of cement border processing center that Carla described earlier. By law, these kiddos are supposed to be processed in less than 72 hours, but sometimes it ends up being a little longer than that. And then once they're processed, they become under the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or the ORR. The ORR is a department under the Health and Human Services branch. It's not the same thing as ICE or Customs Border Protection. And I want to emphasize this because these kiddos come to the hospital with an ORR contracted employee, and that person is not like some sort of like scary officer or anything. They're a guardian. So even though these kids are under the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they are not considered refugees. They are asylum seekers, and they are under the care of the ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And they are applying for like a special status of some sort, usually. Okay, so the ORR contracts with around 300 shelters in over 20 states in the US. And I think there's like 4 or 5 of them in the Houston area. And they are placed in these shelters until their case has kind of been processed. This is what a typical shelter looks like. Facility types range in size and level of security. Usually kiddos are provided with like dorm style rooms, shared bathrooms, showers, clothes, hot meals, year-round education. They have some recreational activities and some limited legal services. Usually the average length of stay in a shelter like this is around a month, or until a community sponsor is identified and background checked and vetted. The vast majority of sponsors are parents of the kiddo or close relatives with whom the kiddo plans to stay permanently. And then once they're placed with the sponsor assumes their care while they await their trial. Sponsors are not given legal guardianship, which can be an issue in certain situations if the sponsor is not a parent. So at the time of entry into the shelter, the kiddos receive an initial medical and mental health evaluation. They also receive, so they have like a physical exam, they get vaccines, they get some like brief testing, TB, pregnancy test, HIV testing. And then the ORR is also responsible for taking them to like a hospital or clinic if needed. And then while under ORR custody, the kiddos have insurance called Point Comfort Underwriters and some medical coordination services. But once they're released from the shelter to their sponsor, they lose that insurance and all of the services. So try to get as much stuff done as possible while they're in the shelter. So while they're in ORR custody, you can call the shelter, talk to the medical team lead, get information or records. And even after they leave the shelter, you can ask for those things as well. And you all may have encountered an unaccompanied immigrant child here at TCH. They usually come with the staff member, like I said. For an emergency procedure, no consent is needed by a guardian, but for non-emergent procedures requiring consent, previously the ORR shelter employee consented on behalf of the kiddos' parents, but like hot off the press, we were recently told that the children's parents should be the ones to consent for procedures, and this should be facilitated through the ORR. So if the physician team asks you guys like, hey, who do I get to consent for this? You can talk to the ORR and have them facilitate the connection with the appropriate person to consent for the procedure. All right, any questions on that so far?
No questions in the chat.
Okay, cool. So what can we do for unaccompanied kiddos while they're in the hospital? If the child has a particularly complicated medical case or one that requires extended treatment, you can refer to the Young Center, which has child advocates for unaccompanied immigrant children. They can't take every unaccompanied immigrant child, and there might be a waiting list, but they're very helpful when a child does have one. They get to know the child's story and then work alongside their attorneys and social workers to make recommendations for the kiddo. And then they can also kind of follow the kiddo after release from the shelter when they go and stay with their sponsor. And then of note, healthcare professionals don't have control over like to whom or when the unaccompanied child leaves the shelter, but we can communicate recommendations to the child's caseworker. And then after the kiddo is placed with a sponsor, like I said, they lose all benefits given by the shelter and the ORR. And then in that case, the kiddo would only qualify for the resources that I mentioned earlier in the asylum seeker undocumented resources slides. Okay, so we've given you guys a ton of information, but here's like just a brief summary slide that kind of talks about what benefits different types of immigrants qualify for. We didn't include those special statuses on here because it's just like, it's very nuanced and it changes pretty frequently. But refugee children should have insurance. They receive basic screening at Harris County Public Health. They have a case manager for up to 5 years, and parents have decision-making authority. Asylum seeking children and undocumented children are only eligible for WIC, emergency Medicaid, children with special health care needs if they have a chronic condition. Very few have received screening labs or physical exams or vaccines during the immigration process, and they usually do not have a case manager or a lawyer. And parents also have the decision-making authority. And then unaccompanied immigrant kiddos are covered by insurance only while they are in the ORR shelter, but not afterwards. And then they also receive a standard like medical and psychological evaluation, vaccine screening labs. And then in terms of obtaining a consent, you should go to the ORR who will help put you in contact with the correct guardian. And then just like very briefly here, like are a few of my Pearl/soapbox points. The first is I recommend using a translator if the parent's preferred language is not English, even if their English seems okay. That's best practice for the family, and many families don't want to burden the care team to go get a translator. Us as physicians are guilty of this. Like I see this happening all the time in the hospital where the parents speak in very broken English, and I know it's annoying to go get a translator, but I recommend just getting the iPad. Second, I've encountered so many patients with social needs who have packets of information delivered to their room, and oftentimes the parent is still kind of confused about like what's on the list and needs additional explanation, especially if there's a low literacy level, which many of these patients do have that. So I recommend using Teach Back with your families. And what that is ask the parents to explain to you what you just explained to them to make sure that they understand, or come back into the room to check in later and make sure that they're still clear about what's in the packets. And then if you think a family would qualify for Gold Card or children with special health care needs, bring the application to their room and help them fill it out, or connect them to the financial services person to help them fill it out. I think these applications are not routinely provided by financial counseling, and financial counseling does have the ability to help families fill out these applications, but I think the parents sometimes need a little bit more guidance, especially at main campus, because the financial counselors are like kind of physically very far away from their like inpatient room. So I think like offering to help bring them down, or like, you know, route them to the correct spot to help them get these applications filled out. And then I also recommend Googling your patient's address and circling the clinic closest to them. Don't just hand them a packet of PCPs. I've had that happen a few times where like someone will just hand them a giant packet of different clinics, and it's a little overwhelming for patients. So offer to call the clinic for them and make their primary care appointment if you have time. I know you guys are spread so thin though. And then if they don't have charity care, I would remind PHM to check with meds to beds, because sometimes PHM docs, they don't like think and they just send everything to meds to beds because it's easy. But meds to beds can be pretty expensive if a kiddo doesn't have insurance. So if they're sending a meds to bed medication, just make sure that the patient's family can afford it. And if they aren't using meds to beds, have the physician find the cheapest kind of medication, like cheapest pharmacy and cheapest like route of medication through GoodRx. And then I would also add financial counselors to y'all's favorite list on Secure Chat. I love Secure Chat. It is so nice. And I think the financial counselors probably hate me because I am constantly sending them messages. That's another tip. And then a couple additional resources is the AAP Immigrant Child Health Toolkit. Provides a ton of detailed information on best practices for immigrant children if you guys want more information. And then Protecting Immigrant Families is another great website that has up-to-date immigration policy information for families, and it's written in a very easy to understand way, and it's available in a ton of different languages. And then last but not least, Purchase Awesome. It's the program for immigrant and refugee child health, as we discussed. It's an organization at TCH that promotes the health of immigrant children through a ton of different like evidence-based quality improvement projects. projects improving access to care, education of medical providers and trainees, and research. So our website has some information on resources like the low-cost clinic list. And then if you all have additional questions, you can always email Carla or myself. Thank you guys so much. And I apologize for the large amount of information in such a brief period of time. It's so hard to like discuss this topic in like an hour and a half time period, but we'll take any questions, additional questions that you guys might have. Thanks, Veronica. So happy you guys found it useful. I know you guys probably already know a lot of this stuff, but you know, it's good to have a refresher.
If anyone has any question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
We can try to make a PDF of it and print it out. I think that should be very doable.
Yeah, we can definitely send it to you in PDF. Looks like there aren't any questions. Formative, just getting a lot of kudos. Okay, I'm just checking the chat real quick to make sure we didn't miss any questions.
So Gina, is there a way for us to get like evaluations for this or no?
Yeah, so after this, I'm going to email all of the participants and ask them to fill out the evaluation, which they'll have to complete in order to receive a certificate of attendance, which can also be used as a CEU.
Will you send us their feedback? Because we really want to know how we can make the presentation more useful or better for people like going forward. So please give us like, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I'll share the data with you.
And thanks for all of your great questions throughout. You know, that was really helpful to see what you were thinking and make sure that we didn't miss critical points before moving on to the next one. So appreciate your participation.
So much for taking the time to present to our department. This was incredibly useful. And just again, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Of course.
We're happy to come back. I think someone mentioned annually. If you want to invite us, we'd be happy to do it.
Great, thank you.
Well, if there are any questions, then thank you all so much for joining. I'll follow up with you through email to get you guys to complete the evaluation. Please look out for that email. Dr. Fredericks and Dr. Michele, thank you so much for your time today and for such an amazing presentation. Everyone, thank you so much. And I hope to see you all again next month. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you guys.